let me ask you one quick question, Fred. When you talk about the Caribbean, because now you got me thinking about the conquistadors and their involvement with slavery throughout the Caribbeans, and that's where I would encourage people to get a map.
Very important.
And really understand the map and look at the waters. So when we make these references, you kind of understand. You talk about the Caribbeans and where we were getting dropped off.
Exactly.
But I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, but that's perfect because we have to look at the map and to kind of weed past all the debating. The two places in this country that had kept the best records to this day. You can go online, but you can go there. I've been there before. St. Augustine, Florida. They have the oldest records in North America, and Vanderbilt University. They kept up with this. So does Seville, Spain. They kept the records in the West Indies, and they kept communication with the King of Spain after the
So let's go back to debunking the myth of these trades, these slave trades.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about the slave trade, we got slavery being going every which way. So it's not just across the Atlantic. You got Indians being traded into South America, North America, whatever, across the Atlantic. And even so, you had a brother from Mozambique get traded, not traded, but he comes to Japan, not Atlantic. He comes with a Jesuit Italian, and they have an animated TV series called Yasuki. Yasuki is a Japanese anime, but it's about a Moor or a black man being vassalage or a slave to a European or Italian Jesuit, and he becomes a samurai. They're saying this is the 1540s, coterminous with all the time that we're talking about, the expulsion of the Moors here. This is going on with Cortez. All of this stuff was happening coterminously, and some of these events are concomitant events because they're battling against the Muslims around the world because they're checking the trap houses of everything that we ran in the Moorish Empire.
Well, let me ask you this. What would you consider one of the common myths of the slave trade?
And I think that how the routes were ran, that's one common myth. If you have brothers going into Japan and being traded off into, and not in the type of, because what we need to look at is the time we're talking about, before you get to the mid 1600s, it wasn't about race.
This is 16th century to 19th century. When I say transatlantic slave trade, it's that 16th to 19th
So
century.
it wasn't about race. The role that the Moors played, because we're gonna have to tackle that, because Moors were participated in slavery. They talk about the Arabs and Turks, but the Moors, they participated in slavery, but it wasn't about race. Spanish picked up the same principles because the Moors and the Spaniards battled, and then they were bedfellows and all of that. So initially, it wasn't about race; it was just about the exploitation of labor, or just indentured servitude. We didn't get to perpetual slavery until the mid to late 1600s at the Virginia Assembly.
Because now, when I say triangular or transatlantic, that's mostly Europe, America, Africa.
They talk about across. They don't talk about the Caribbean. They don't talk about Japan. They don't talk about these little areas, and we don't talk about the brothers in East Africa being traded off or being placed into Japan. These are very important things. Now, I think that in this country, the way we look at slavery has less to do with history and more to do with the psychological effect of how we categorize historical events. This is important because when you say slavery, first thing that comes to people's mind is African on boats. But if I tell you that Native American was in slavery, you would think dispossession, expulsion.
What else we think? Chains and Middle Passage.
No. They experienced the same thing that we experienced in this time frame. Oklahoma being expelled, the expulsion of the Moors in Grenada, Barcelona. At the same time these things were going on, they were expelling the Native Americans.
I got now you bringing me to something that that we discussed offline. We're doing the dive and trying to figure out, okay, where were our people at? And crept up on a brother named Abram Petrovic, Hannibal.
Yeah.
So I want to get into the presence of the Moors in Russia. But now we're talking about the slave trade and the routes. Interesting thing. for one, just as a background, he was brought as a black servant to Tsar Peter the Great, or Peter the First. Peter the Great was in Russia. But before we even get there, he was considered a West African, of course, West African slave trade, in particular Cameroon.
Yeah.
He was kidnapped. He was sold to the Arabs first. He was sold to the Arabs in West Africa. Then he was sold to the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, Constantinople. And here's where it gets interesting. From there, he was taken to Russia as a gift to Peter the Great. He was freed once he got to Russia. He was freed, adopted, and raised as a godson to Peter the Great. Now, one thing that makes it interesting, it's a poet that I studied, and interesting story about him, Alexander Pushkin, very famous Russian poet, writer. This guy, Abram Petrovich, is his great grandfather.
Yeah.
Because he had, I want to say he had maybe 11 kids. This is all happening in Russia.
Yeah.
This is considered the Moorish presence in Russia. Coming from West Africa, being traded.
You're debunking the transatlantic slave myth. You're talking about what I'm talking about.
The Arabs, then the Ottoman, and then taken to Russia as a gift. This is a human being being taken as a gift, and then they adopt him. Now, this is the cold thing about us. He became a military engineer, a major general. He excelled in the arts and science and warfare. He rose to captain during the French and the Spain War. Now, during that war is when he adopted the surname of Hannibal. They spelled it with a G because of Russia.
H and G.
But the Hannibal that we know out of Carthage with the elephants.
Yeah.
So that ties into his warfare mind as a general around that time. So now we're getting into these dropouts and making it all the way to Russia and having that presence.
And you're debunking the myth of transatlantic slave trade.
And this is 1690. He was born 1697. So this is still around that 17th century, the 1600s going into the 1700s around that time. And of course, trying to document someone, they say 1696. It could have been earlier. Could have been a little later, because I want to say he died around the age of 85. But I said all that to say, from where we're calling these slave trades, and this person ended up in Russia, being adopted, not being considered a slave in Russia, being adopted, being considered a godson, and then being a descendant of this Russian writer, Alexander Pushkin. So all this stuff kind of comes into play, and we start talking about the slave trade and our presence in different places. Yeah. Starting in Mesoamerica, and we talked about the Olmec, and we talked about the deeper dive of the African presence in Mexico, and I would say Black Mexicans.
Yeah. And you just came from Russia. This is a big swath of the world that we're covering in just a little bit of time. The Moorish presence,
and how the Aztec and the Black presence in Mexico, and Cortez, and describing the Moorish complexion, the Moorish clothing, and then building it up, and like you said, debunking some of the myth, because a lot in school we hear about transatlantic slave trade. That's what we hear about. Now they don't delve into the Caribbean a lot of times, in the other places where we were dropped off, and it kind of ties into the whole talk about reparations and the African descendants, or what's the group? African descendants of slaves or something like that.
The ADOS.
Yeah, the ADOS. Yeah. And all of that kind of has a tie, but I really just wanted this session to really start on that African presence in Mexico, and then building up to that African presence.
And I want you to stay
in Russia.
But before we go to Cortez, because I need to talk about that and to
let's get
kind of draw the direction and ferret through that part. But it's a book called The Orientalist by Tom Rees. And it's about a Jewish man. And when you ever get this book, or just Google it, The Orientalist. On the cover, it's a Jewish guy, a Sephardic Jewish guy, on the cover with his legs crossed like this with a fez on. When you hear about his extraordinary life, he had to survive in Russia by pretending to be a Muslim because they had a lot of respect. You said the Ottomans. The Ottomans, they had the Beys, Els, and the Alis. This was a Muslim, or at one point it was a Muslim presence. The Muslim...
Which is ironic because with Ferdinand and Isabella, and like, you gotta go. If you want to accept Christianity, you gotta go.
You gotta go.
So it was almost like refuge.
Yeah, and there were a lot of places we had refuge, but that was one of the places. But in the book, they're talking about Moorish dilapidated palaces. And you're talking about at a time where you're talking about it's dilapidated by centuries. So it's been there for years, and it goes back to Hannibal, Carthage, elephants, on mountains, in Siberia, in his strategy. Our presence had already been there. Cortez, I want to get back to that. Cortez comes and he finds blacks or Africans, Moors living with Native Americans and Spanish people. Because you talk about a shipwreck, because there was multiple shipwrecks, because then they came before Columbus, he mentioned shipwrecks. You talk about a Wolof tribe, a Muslim tribe. But they had been there for so long when Cortez, by the time Cortez get there, the Spanish that he sees, that he knows is the lineage to Spain, they don't want to come back. They say, no, these are people. We've already learned the ways of the Indians and African. Their cultures have melded together. That's how you get the book called The Mexican Pyramid, when Cortez and the crew are decapitating the heads of Aztecs, putting them on swivels for practicing Moorish science, alchemy, astronomy. This was the reign against the Muslim presence, or this is the continuation of Granada and the beef with the Moors and the religion and the culture. They didn't want to come back, so it was a war. They went back and told the king, they came back with reinforcement, and this is how you get the Cortez battle in the Yucatan.
If you're watching this on YouTube, man, hey, y'all, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. This is Gentleman's History Hour.